Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how to replace the radiator on a Honda S2000. I'm replacing the radiator on this car because the owner tracks this car pretty often and wants to upgrade to something more effective than the stock radiator. Although his OEM radiator is perfectly fine, there are many documented cases of the OEM radiator failing. The radiator tank on the OEM radiator is made of plastic, and like most plastic things, it will deteriorate over time and eventually crack. Anyway, let's get to it. The first thing you want to do is jack up the car and get the front of the car on jack stands. The next thing you want to do is remove the air intake since it sits on top of the OEM radiator. If you need help removing your air intake, you can check out my air intake removal video, which will be linked down below. Now you'll want to drain the coolant from the OEM radiator. If you're unsure how to safely drain the coolant from the Honda S2000, you can check out my Coolant Flush video, which will be linked down below. Once the coolant has been drained, you'll want to remove all the hoses connected to the radiator. Start by removing the coolant overflow tank hose from the radiator. Once the hose is removed, lift the coolant overflow tank to remove it from the engine bay. Next, you'll want to remove the lower and upper radiator hoses. Use a combination of pliers to remove the hose clamps securing the radiator hoses to the OEM radiator. For the upper radiator hose, this is quite simple. The lower radiator hose is a little bit trickier. If you don't have the OEM plastics, you should be able to access the lower radiator hose directly. If you do have the OEM plastics like on this car, you can access the lower radiator hose through the plastics or from above, depending on how the hose clamp is rotated. Once the hose clamps are removed, the radiator hoses are going to be bonded to the OEM radiator. The trick to breaking the hoses free is to twist them until they break free. You can use a set of pliers to help you twist the hoses. Once the radiator hoses are free, fold them away so they are out of the way and don't leak any additional coolant. The next thing you want to remove are 3 electrical connectors. On the passenger side, you'll need to disconnect the radiator fan connector, and on the driver's side, you'll need to disconnect the AC fan connector. The last connector is the engine coolant temperature sensor connector, which is located near the lower radiator hose. The last thing attached to the OEM radiator should be the radiator stays. Use a 10mm socket to remove the 2 bolts securing the radiator stays to the frame of the car. The OEM radiator should be completely free now. Simply lift it upwards to remove it from the car. Your new radiator likely does not come with fans, an engine coolant temperature sensor, or rubber bushings, so you'll need to transfer these components over from your OEM radiator. Use a 10mm socket to remove the 5 bolts securing the fans to the OEM radiator, and install the 5 bolts securing the fans to the new radiator. Torque these bolts to 5 foot-pounds. Use a 24mm deep socket or wrench to remove the engine coolant temperature sensor, and install the engine coolant temperature sensor onto the new radiator. Your new radiator may come with a coolant temperature sensor adapter, so feel free to remove it if necessary. Torque the coolant temperature sensor to 17 foot-pounds. Lastly, remove the rubber bushings from the bottom of the OEM radiator and slip them onto the bottom of the new radiator. With everything transferred over to the new radiator, carefully lower the radiator back into place. Make sure the rubber bushings sit correctly in the frame of the car. Use a 10mm socket to install the 2 bolts securing the radiator stays to the frame of the car. Torque them to 8.7 foot-pounds. Next, reconnect the 3 electrical connectors on the new radiator. On the passenger side, you'll need to connect the radiator fan connector, and on the driver's side, you'll need to connect the AC fan connector. The last connector is the engine coolant temperature sensor connector, which is located near the lower radiator hose. Reinstallation of the radiator hoses is pretty straightforward. Slip the lower radiator hose onto the new radiator, and then use a set of angled needle nose pliers to reinstall the hose clamp. follow the same procedure for the upper radiator hose. Lastly, insert the coolant overflow tank back into place and connect the coolant overflow tank hose to the radiator. Reinstall the air intake. If you need help doing that, I've got videos that will be linked down below. Now you'll need to refill the radiator with coolant and bleed the system of any air. If you're unsure how to refill the coolant and bleed the system on a Honda S2000, you can check out my Coolant Flush video, which will be linked down below. Specifically for this video, I will note that aftermarket radiators like this one may have a different size radiator cap than the OEM radiator. I was still able to use one of the adapters in my spill-free funnel kit, but it was an extremely tight fit and clearly not designed for this radiator. Once you've bled the system of any air, get the car off jack stands and lower it back down to the ground. As a final step, you'll want to take your car out for a test drive around the neighborhood and inspect the new radiator for any leaks. You don't want to go too far from home in case the car starts to overheat for some reason. As the car reaches operating temperature, keep an eye on the coolant temperature indicator on the gauge cluster. For AP1s, you don't want to see anything greater than 3 bars, and for AP2s, you don't want to see anything greater than 8 bars. In the event that the car does begin to overheat, you're going to want to pull over safely and shut the car off until it cools down. Once you finish the test drive, you'll want to inspect the radiator for any new leaks. Specifically look at the radiator cap, the engine coolant temperature sensor, and the radiator hoses. And that's it. If you found this video helpful or entertaining, give this video a thumbs up and smash that subscribe button if you haven't already. As always, leave a comment down below for a DIY you'd like to see in the future.